logically, we should be seeing falling rates.
Things aren't so simple.
There is so many plates spinning and so many different things for them to be considering. Not just the budgeting, but the resilience of supply chains next year.
We set a new record high in August, which is quite an impressive thing to do when you consider the fact that what is one of the world's biggest trades, China to the US, that was down 25% compared to a year ago. Welcome to the Freight Debate, the ultimate destination for supply chain professionals, logistics leaders, and anyone who's ever wondered what really keeps the world moving. I'm Emily Stausbøll, analyst at Xeneta, joined once again by Phil.
Thank you, Emily. Lovely to be here again, and plenty to talk about. Been a couple of weeks, hasn't it? Now, so maybe 3 weeks since we did a Freight Debate, talking about the Xeneta outlook.
I think it was a pre-summit, and the timelines don't really work together, pre and post-summit.
Our timelines in the past few weeks have been pretty hectic anyway, haven't they? I suppose the it's interesting, isn't it? I mean, we published our Xeneta outlook for 2026 at the Xeneta Summit in Barcelona a couple of weeks ago, and it's already interesting to see how some of the themes that we picked out so recently are already starting to play out in the world, and maybe that's what we should focus on in this episode of the Freight Debate, because there's been a lot of developments, a lot of interest, whether it's geopolitical or rates. So shall we dive in, Emily, and discuss the topics for this week? So we're going to give you a bit of feedback from the Xeneta Summit, not us, but what's being talked about in the industry, because there was hundreds of shippers, carriers, freight forwarders, the industry stakeholders there, and there was some really interesting conversations going on. So we'll provide a little bit of feedback from that. We'll talk about latest volume figures for container shipping, some really interesting developments there, and some interesting rate developments in the past week as well, which I'm sure our listeners and viewers will be interested in. And then we can talk about all the other stuff that's going on between the US and China, but more of that later. So yeah, first topic for this episode of the Freight Debate, Emily, the summit. What was kind of top of mind when you were talking to our customers or industry stakeholders generally?
Well, like you said, we had published the outlook, and we can kind of sit here and say what we think is going to happen and write that out. But in reality, it's talking about it with the people who are actually playing in the market and what they think. And I think for me, the headlines of the outlook was really, it should be an easier year to be a shipper next year. It should be cheaper, and you should be able to expect higher service. But as soon as you kind of talk like that, I think that the most common question I got in return was, yeah, but can carriers not manage their way out of this by managing capacity? And I think that's definitely a fair point. That's one of the things we're looking at. Sure, it's one of the things we'll jump onto when we talk about rates. But I think one of the examples I showed at Summit was looking at Far East to US capacity and spot rates. And you see two very different phases. The first phase, which was in April and May, immediately after Liberation Day, it was called. We know that those volumes from China to the US dropped off very, very quickly, and yet spot rates remained flat, and that's because carriers managed to remove capacity. So for carriers, that's the ideal scenario. Demand drop, but we removed enough capacity to keep rates up. What we're seeing now, and maybe let's just cut off where we were at Summit before rates jumped, was actually that rates were falling far below where they were in April, and yet carriers, if anything, they were adding more capacity. And there's a dilemma there for carriers, because on one hand, of course, they want higher rates, but on the other hand, they also want market share. And arguably, it's easy to agree in the most loose sense of the world. I'm not accusing anybody of collusion or whatever the word is, but kind of we can all remove capacity. It's short term, and we believe it'll come back. If you're looking at what we expect to be a much longer year, at least the first 6 months of 2026 with lower demand, actually accepting to lose out market share, remove capacity is tricky. It's a bit like your classical prisoner's dilemma. Of course, you want there to be less capacity so rates go up. You just don't want to be the one removing capacity. So it's a question of whether carriers can kind of figure out a way in the longer term, in the face of kind of a prolonged demand downturn, to manage capacity. And I think at the moment, I'm more skeptical of them being willing to and being able to do so.
Yeah, but it is that level of uncertainty, isn't it? And obviously, shippers would be pleased to read and hear our outlook for 2026 of the general direction for rates being downwards. But it would just be a massive oversimplification, wouldn't it? And certainly given the conversations that we were having in Barcelona with industry stakeholders at the summit, that it isn't as simple as that, is it? There are so many plates spinning and so many different things for them to be considering and factoring into not just the budgeting, but the resilience of supply chains next year. It is still, I suppose the point is, people aren't sitting around at the summit kind of, relaxing and taking a big sigh
booking their holidays.
Booking their holidays out there.
No.
The feedback that we got on the conversations were it's gonna be another really tough year, isn't it? Maybe in slightly different ways to 2024 and 2025, but still a very difficult year for most shippers.
And it kind of comes back to us kind of saying, okay, this is what the fundamentals suggest with supply and demand and the balance there. The question is, are the fundamentals going to be what's dictating the market next year? And we saw in 2024, well, in a way, yes, but Red Sea kind of changed those fundamentals dramatically last year or this year with tariffs. So it's kind of a question of how much other stuff comes in from outside, so to say. It means that those fundamentals aren't actually what's dictating freight rates.
Yeah. Well, let's talk about some fundamentals, but let's talk about volumes and the impact those fundamentals having on volumes. Latest data is interesting, isn't it? Certainly, if we're considering how we're going to be moving into 2026. So can you explain a little bit more at a global and US level in particular?
Well, globally, it looks great. US import-wise, it doesn't look quite so good. So globally, we set a new record high in August, which is quite an impressive thing to do when you consider the fact that what is one of the world's biggest trades, China to the US, that was down 25% compared to a year ago. That's 300,000 TEU that weren't being transported on that trade, just basically disappeared. And despite that, we still get a global record. And that's largely to do with the fact that if you compare August 2025 with August 2024, China basically managed to send its goods somewhere else. It more than makes up for the loss in exports to the US. So its exports were up about 3.5% to Europe, to the Southeast Asia, to Africa, South and Central America, all those kind of things. The other side of that is then US imports. And of course, there's a big drop there from the Far East. But basically, they have lost imports from everywhere. It's down across the board. And of course, they're putting tariffs in place everywhere else. But it's really a picture of kind of the US isolating itself, people exporting less to there, but finding alternatives in the rest of the world and finding that higher demand.
I'm going to ask you probably an impossible question to answer here. That
wouldn't be the first time.
No, it wouldn't. No. But it can't continue, can it? When you talk about the US isolating itself from the world and falling demand into the US from basically every other nation, considering the US is the driving force of consumer demand, possibly in the world.
Yeah.
Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, I think let's say there's two things that play into it. I think August is also evidence of an early peak season coming through, so we'd expect that to drop off now quite quickly in September, October, and not hold on for as long as it usually would. But there is also a limit as to how much of the goods that typically the US would get can be absorbed by the rest of the world. Can Europe really take so many hundreds of thousands more containers? Is there demand for that in Southeast Asia or everywhere else? So to me, that was also an indication, okay, we sent more volumes than needed into Europe. It's not like the European economy is absolutely soaring. So that should lead to a flip side that leads to lower demand through the rest of this year, as rates would also suggest, and then going into next year as well. But you can't, for a long, prolonged period, just completely erase the US and not see that having a major impact on global trade.
Yeah, exactly.
And even if you take away from that, sending a container from China to the US is one of the longest trade routes you can get. So we've talked a lot about TEU mile demand, as in the transport work, how far a container needs to be moved. You're replacing it with Europe, Africa, Southeast Asia. All of those trips are shorter. So even though China has actually grown its exports, the transport work to be done is falling more than proportionally because that longest trade has basically been cut down.
Okay, so that suggests really falling rates, doesn't it? So if we've got lower volumes going to the US, then logically we should be seeing falling rates. However,
things aren't so simple.
No. Can you explain?
Well, so we've seen in the middle of October some, at the moment, what looks like successful GRIs from the Far East to the US. Carriers pushing up their rates. I think it was, what did we say, 30%, Phil?
We've got Far East to US West Coast up 31%, Far East to East Coast Main up 20% on the Zanetta platform at the moment, yeah.
So that's quite considerable increases. In a time where we would usually expect, especially mid-October, that's kind of post-Golden Week, lower demand, end of peak season, all those kind of things that come in and should mean that rates are coming down. But clearly that's not happened at the moment. The GRIs are sticking. I keep saying at the moment because it wouldn't be the first time that we saw a GRI that initially sticks for a few days and then drops down. It's what we saw at the start of September. It held for 4 or 5 days before it started dropping quite rapidly. And we're still lower than those levels now, even with these mid-month GRIs. But there is also always an element of supply and demand balance in the market. If capacity is being shifted, be it for Golden Week, be it for the port fees that we'll get into and some changes happening there. And it's always the case that when we talk about falling rates next year and an easier market, that's really on a global level. But there is always a possibility of a flare up somewhere on particular trades, and that's what we're seeing here now. My guess is if this is something that sticks, we'll see more capacity being added at a time when the trade doesn't actually really need more capacity, and that would bring rates down again. So I think, you know, we always talk about kind of there can be short-term peaks and higher rates in different places, but globally, carriers are able to move their ships around that shouldn't hold for an extended period.
Yeah, and just for reference, we're recording this on the 22nd of October, so just in case there's a delay in this being published, or there's a delay in when people actually listen to this episode of the Freight Debate, because, as you say,
no, it might have gone in 3 days' time. We'll have got a bunch of updates from our customers and that show that actually they might have shipped at those prices for 2 or 3 days, but then they were able to get lower rates again.
Yeah, and certainly if one of our Zanetta customers look in the platform and they see the increase in rates and they also see an increase in offered capacity, then they will push back on those GRIs, will they not?
They should try, yeah. They should definitely try. Now, if it's because of some tariff deadlines or whatever that increases the pressure here now, or that they have realized they don't have the goods they need for Christmas, they thought they'd got what they had in, all those things can kind of push that you might be willing to pay a little bit more than what you might be able to push for if you're willing to kind of really go right down to the bone. But it should be. And even if, you know, we know the capacity is there in the market, so you should be able to have that pushback.
The GRI is coming in mid-October, carriers pushing rates up. Nothing ever happens without reason, does it? There's got to be something behind it. So what could be, do you think, behind these rate hikes, whether they stick or not? You know, what could be behind it? What's going on at the moment?
There's an awful lot going on at the moment, especially if you take the US trades. So kind of seasonally wise, what is normal, we can say, is Golden Week and that kind of post period. Maybe we're picking up a little bit faster than we might have expected otherwise. You also have the port fees, the US port fees that came into effect the 14th of October, which, as we've seen it, and I'm sure we'll get onto in a second, have the biggest effect on shippers, but it can affect how capacity deployed as carriers change that. Possibly a bigger effect is the kind of Chinese port fees, because they came in on the same day as the US ones, but were announced far, far closer to the date. So carriers haven't had that same amount of time to kind of adapt. Then I think there's also the last thing, which is kind of carriers figuring out what is the new demand level on this trade. So we said in August, the 25% drop. We've seen carriers announcing blank sailings, all the rest of it linked to Golden Week, but we've also seen services being suspended altogether, or for the next 6 months, whatever it might be. So it's kind of a whole mess of things that carriers are trying to find out, okay, what capacity can I best deploy in this trade, taking into account port fees, all the rest of it. And then what is actually the demand level with the tariffs coming in place? Of course, we're looking at 1st of November with potentially more tariffs coming through then. So it's kind of trying to find that new balance. And I don't think we've quite found it yet.
Not often anyone says this. In fairness to carriers, if shippers are a little unsure about the volumes that they're going to be moving, then it kind of puts, maybe for once, carriers in a position of having less visibility. Because usually we think of carriers as the people who all knowing,
yeah.
Kind of, you know, they have this visibility of what's being shipped and where it's being shipped and shipped by whom. But they may that kind of visibility may not be there now because shippers don't actually know what they're going to be shipping from one week to the next. So there is going to be that flux.
And that was a conversation I had with several shippers at our summit again about you want certainty from your carriers and the rest of it. But we've talked before here about how you can become a shipper of choice for carriers. And one of the ways to do that is to know your volumes. You have your minimum quantity commitments, you are in place, and you can live up to those. That becomes incredibly difficult now. I think the general feeling I got was that actually carriers were being relatively open and willing to work together on it. It was not necessarily that they waive everything and we can ignore the fact that you're not meeting your requirements. That there was a willingness to kind of work together around this, because carriers can also see that this is a really, really tricky situation to be a shipper in.
We've talked about volume developments year to date. We've talked about rate developments, but all of this is happening against the backdrop of geopolitical power plays and using trade to further geopolitical ambitions is probably the polite way to put this. So let's spend the last section of this episode of the Freight Debate, Emily, looking at this geopolitical situation at the moment, because it isn't easy to keep track of, but it's casting this long shadow, isn't it, over global trade at the moment. So maybe a good place to start is tariffs. I mean, sound like tariff klaxon again. We're talking about tariffs, but it has been the theme of this year, hasn't it? And there's more. The roller coaster isn't ready to pull into the station yet, is it? So, where are we?
Well, as we speak here today, we are still expecting a 100% increase in tariffs on Chinese imports into the US come 1st of November. Let's see if they actually enter into force. I think, we were at 145%, was it a few weeks before that came back down? And, I'll say it again, but this 25% drop in exports from China to the US, that is when tariffs were at 30%. Let alone 130% plus whatever tariffs were in place for certain existing goods. That's a huge difference. To me, it sounds more like you want to, to strengthen your hand when you go to the negotiating table. China has limited export on rare earth. Okay, the US will put in place 100% fees. It kind of gives them something to discuss when they sit down and hopefully try and find a solution, rather than this constant kind of back and forth. Whether that be directly on tariffs, whether it be Chinese or US farmers are struggling to sell many of the goods that they typically sell to China. That's also an issue for the Trump administration. All those kind of things play in. Also bringing us to port fees with the Chinese retaliation there that came rather last minute when you think about the timelines we work on in this industry.
Two kind of comments on that, really. One of them goes back to what we said earlier, that it's just not sustainable in the long term to cut the US off from the rest of the world. It can't happen, can it? But also, yes, I get that there's negotiation tactics, and maybe the US want to go to the table with something, maybe kind of asking for too much or threatening too much, and have the ability to roll back and still get what they want. I get that. But if you're...
It's still a nightmare.
It's a nightmare.
I could feel where you were going. It's still absolutely... You're being taken as a kind of card in this, and you're trying to figure out what's going on, and you just can't rely on anything.
No. And, let's say we're talking about volumes. The difference in volumes that a shipper is going to commit to in 2026 with tariffs on their goods at 130% rather than 30%
it's night and day.
But the shippers are going to be having those conversations now, aren't they, with carriers, presumably?
Yeah. Well, I think internally, first and foremost, they need to figure out what is it we're producing, where are we buying it from, what do we actually think demand will be like, how much of this cost can we absorb and not pass to customers, all those kind of things. And at the end of that, you say, okay, this is then what we present to our carriers and see if we can work out a solution there. But it's all, we're talking about China here, but there are tariffs on the vast majority of countries at the moment. We've still got 50% on India and Brazil, and so it's really, really tricky. And in a way, it's easier to say, okay, actually, now we know it's 30%. This is what we have. This is what we'll deal with. We can work on that. The fact that we still, 6 months after Liberation Day, are still sitting here thinking we don't actually know what tariffs will be like in a month's time is really problematic.
Well, that isn't all in terms of this geopolitical climate. Port fees, there's a kind of to and fro there between US and China as well.
Yeah, and I think again, come summit, we were talking the 9th and 10th of October, which I believe was before we heard about the Chinese retaliation, and we also got questions like, "This is such a huge thing; it's happening next week." When we were speaking, we didn't spend much time on it in the outlook, and that was because we had kind of seen it as, this is a problem for carriers, and of course carriers have to figure it out. But as we see it at the moment, it's not something that's being passed on to shippers. They're not kind of feeling the strains. Carriers are managing to switch out that capacity, and even those who can't and who are facing these fees are not at the moment able to pass the costs on. They have this extra criteria about sort of ownership and how much of a share you can have that in the US, which becomes very complicated, especially maybe for the other shipping sectors when you talk about bulker and tanker shipping, where you have some more US listed companies than you necessarily do in shipping, but it's still a problem. A Matson ship I think Matson ship was the first that actually faced these fees, and a ship under 5,000 TEU, so not a very big ship, got $1.7 million. That's a huge extra cost on a carrier, and they're going to struggle, Matson, to find an alternative. So this is also a big one to watch. Yes, carriers are going to try and move those ships around. Definitely watching this as yet another cost for shippers, and a little bit of question of, is this something that's going to hold in the long term, or is this something China said, well, we need to get this because then we can offer to remove these port fees if the US does the same on its side.
Yeah, and that's been the way it's just been tit for tat since Liberation Day, hasn't it? Whatever the US does, China retaliates, and when China retaliates, this is what and this, it's this spiraling, escalating trade war. That's what it is, isn't it? Neither side is. Maybe we should get Trump and G on free debate, Emily. We'll sort it out.
You think you could moderate a solution? I think I'll stay out of that one. I'll let you do that.
Don't underestimate the power of the freight debate. Last point on this geopolitical section of the freight debate: IMO emissions regulations. You were on the BBC on Friday night, weren't you, talking about this? I heard you. Can you bring people up to speed? Because it's disappointing, isn't it? I think we are a neutral organisation, but I'm happy to say it feels a bit of a step backwards, doesn't it, to not come to some kind of agreement? Yeah.
So just to spell it out, the IMO basically a UN body, but they agreed to this new net zero framework, a new measure, a new regulation in place to try and get the shipping industry to the target the IMO has, which is a net neutrality by rather greenhouse gas neutrality by 2050. Well, actually, I should say by or around 2050, because that is what the regulation says. And again, it's the IMO, and it's often becomes a compromise there. And I think that's where the Iran comes in. And this deal was also slightly compromised. Some countries wanted it to go further and other countries were against it. But they agreed on this deal in April. And I think, generally speaking, the clear expectation was that it would be passed now in October, and it would enter into force come 2028. But the US kind of became increasingly vocal about its resistance to this phase. We saw all sorts of threats coming from them, whether that was tariffs, port fees, not letting the ships call at US ports, ships flagged to that country. And I think also above trade, we were talking about visa restrictions and all those kind of things. And for many countries, that kind of pressure when the US is their biggest trading partner was enough to kind of say, actually, we're not willing to go that far for this. But I know they didn't vote no, they voted to kind of delay the vote by a year. But it's tricky to see really what can be changed, what can we change enough that it still is a meaningful regulation that has a potential of getting us to net zero, but while still having enough support to get it through.
What's just the impression that this gives? And we can talk kind of, how do you describe it, semantics, and how far do you go in criticism? But whatever you think about the US or any other nation, it's another example of how much power the US is able to exert at a global level using trade and container shipping specifically, or maritime shipping specifically, to further its ambitions.
Of course, shipping is linked to kind of the IMO. But tariffs are typically used in specific goods to protect an industry at home, to prevent against uncompetitive practices, whatever that might be, not because there's a new regulation coming in about carbon emission and carbon intensity. And sort of for now, of course, people in the shipping world know this because this is this regulation. But there'll be people in all other industries who are also hearing threats of tariffs or visa restrictions because they don't know this one thing happening at the IMO in London. And that might also be the case for us kind of later down the road, that suddenly something completely separate in a completely different industry then comes in to have tariff restrictions. And that is also something that everybody has to become very aware of. I mean, I think, the US resistance has been voiced in that they are concerned about this turning into a tax on US consumers through higher prices. And I think I can see already on your face, Phil, that is it those in glass houses shouldn't throw stones? Should we leave it at that?
I mean, there's just a clear contradiction, irony. Insert, listeners' views can insert whatever word they want into that sentence, can't they? But we've talked in this episode, haven't we? And it's probably a nice way to kind of round this off, because it takes us all the way back to the start of falling volumes into the US and question marks over consumer demand in the US due to tariffs that the US is imposing on imports for goods entering the country. So there's an undeniable irony there, isn't there, that they cite the IMO regulations as being a tax on their own consumers. So,
but maybe we can finish off a little bit more optimistic.
Yes, please do. Please do.
So basically, we've kind of parked this regulation, and even if it had been voted through now, carriers would only be paying for these emissions come 2028. So this is a way off. But especially in container shipping, and container shipping is more advanced than the other shipping sectors, we have that push from shippers as well that they want a cleaner product. So it's a very tricky place for carriers to be, because they are wanting to offer more. We talked in the outlook, we have a record high order book of about 10 million TEU, more than that. 9 million of those TEU have some form of alternative fuel capability. Now, for carriers, the fact that this regulation doesn't go through is a huge sort of blow, because they need certainty about what to invest in. Are we investing in LNG, or is that just a short term and it's not going to meet the requirements of future regulation? The ships that are sailing now and those that are on order will still be sailing come 2050. So they need that certainty. But we are seeing that push specifically in container shipping for greener fuels, greener emissions, largely because of how closely connected it is to kind of the end users and the push coming through there. So all hope is not lost. It just becomes, again, as in many other places that we talk about, kind of even murkier and trickier to work in.
Yeah, well, you've cheered me up.
That's good.
Thank you. It's an important point, isn't it, that we don't want to paint the picture as being too doom and gloom. We just tell it as it is. But again, let's end it on a positive note. With my kind of final sign off for this episode of the freight debate is along those lines, that I think shippers they feel confident, more confident of being able to navigate these challenges. I don't think they're under any illusions, are they, that how difficult these challenges are. But I think I don't know whether it's a kind of, just it's now become part of their life to navigate these challenges, and they've got the tools to be able to navigate the challenges. You
can look back at all the shit that's been thrown at them for the past 5 or 6 years now. They got through that, maybe not perfectly, and it was tough, all the rest of it, but that's been done. Probably we can also manage the next thing. Yeah, exactly. And again, you kind of do have to doff your cap to people in the industry, don't you, for getting through all this, and they'll get through it again in 2026 and 2027 and the decades ahead, because they always do. What a nice note to finish our episode. Thank you to our listeners and viewers for joining us again. We hope you enjoyed it as much as we did producing it. Please hit subscribe and get alerts for the next episode, and let's move this industry forward together. Until next time, thank you and goodbye.